Welcome to VidZet, your home for careful consideration of our common concerns. I'm Dr. Ted Noel. The law of subsidy states that when you subsidize something, you will get more of it and it will get more expensive. South Florida is home to the most expensive subsidy program the federal government has. You heard that right. The program only makes the federal government spend $3 to $4 billion out of a multi-trillion-dollar budget. That's like dropping a penny on the sidewalk. In theory, no one will notice, but then the law of subsidy steps in and raises the price dramatically. It just does it by a different mechanism. Sugar in the U.S. comes largely for sugarcane. This tropical plant is very labor-intensive to harvest. It also requires processing near the fields, since the unrefined cane does not travel well. In short, it is ideally suited to slave labor. And that's how it was originally processed. Obviously, after the Civil War, King Sugar had to change. After the Depression, as part of recovery efforts, the federal government began to subsidize sugarcane farming. The supposed benefit was to protect an important industry from devastating effects of economic changes. Now that alone should have been enough to ring alarm bells, but remember that the law of the bureaucrat says that the prime directive is to solve a problem. Politicians are the biggest bureaucrats that exist, and this was a ready-made excuse for them to do something, which is the political form of the prime directive. Whether you do something good or bad is almost unimportant. The key is that you've got to do something. Sugar subsidies take money from taxpayers and give it to sugar farmers. But a lot of the subsidies don't just pass dollar bills around. Instead, they take the form of tariffs and price supports. Tariffs raise the price of sugar by making imported sugar more expensive. Now that only takes a few pennies from customers for each pound of sugar. You pay the price at the cash register, not the tax office, but it's still a tax. Without it, you wouldn't have to pay so much for that Snickers bar. Sugar growers take this extra profit and see a way to make even more money, so they fertilize their cane fields more. This fertilizer runs off into the Everglades, poisoning a natural treasure at the heart of South Florida's water supply. Now, the Florida and the federal government have to spend huge amounts to clean up the Everglades. Because the evil sugar farmers have done this, they have to pay part of the tab. But where do they get the money? Oh, I forgot. The sugar farmers have enough money to pay for their part of the cleanup because tariffs gave them higher prices for their crop. Sugar farmers didn't pay for it at all. You paid for it at the cash register, but that's not all. Another form of sugar subsidy is the price support. Basically, this is a price guarantee that the government gives to sugar farmers. If tariffs aren't enough to stop foreign competition, the government guarantees to buy domestic sugar at preset high prices. But if sugar farmers make way too much, then that support stops. So they only milk the taxpayer and the consumer just right. And price supports just make the injury to us from tariffs a bit worse. But remember, the sugar farmers love them. And that's why they're running false attack ads against Ron DeSantis. He's running for governor of Florida, he's a member of the House Freedom Caucus, and he opposes sugar subsidies. To hide their lies, the PAC uses the word conservative in its name. But these direct subsidies are just the tip of the iceberg. The real problem is perverted science. The best way for a subsidy to hide is if it's somehow good for you. In response to an overhyped CBS documentary titled Hunger in America, the Senate created the McGovern Commission. In the 1970s, it issued its report, and that report was pure gold for sugar growers. It established the food pyramid with carbohydrates, that's sugar, as the foundation. You were supposed to get lots of grains, fruits, and other sources of sugar as the bulk of your diet. Let's see. We have lived with minimal obesity, heart disease, kidney failure, and diabetes for thousands of years without the government telling us how to eat. But all of a sudden, we started to see more of these bad things, and the government had to do something to solve the problem. But it didn't bother to do the simplest bit of scientific inquiry. Of course, that might get in the way of a government solution, defeating the law of the bureaucrat. We can't have that happen. Up until about 1900, heart attack and type 2 diabetes were quite rare. But agricultural production exploded with the development of mechanized farming, irrigation, and fertilizers. The Great Plains became America's breadbasket. Emphasis on bread and pasta. And the key ingredient in bread and pasta is wheat. Further, this wheat is different from the wheat used to make bread centuries before. It was hybridized to increase yield and ground into much finer flour than the stone mill wheels of years before could make. These combined to make the starch in the wheat granules almost instantly available to the bloodstream. Commercial farming made it cheaper than dairy, poultry, and meat products, so it became a staple food. The average American didn't make a huge dietary shift. It was a small shift. But it was enough to start a trend toward obesity. Now, if McGovern's committee had bothered to look, they'd have seen this trend already. And they'd have had the data to identify the cause. But why do that when you have agricultural interests begging for public money and willing to make campaign contributions? Why indeed? By then, wheat and sugar were big business, and the business of America is business, isn't it? So the McGovern report came out with its full-throated denunciation of the diet that had served us well for thousands of years. Instead, we got the food pyramid, which pushes lots of carbs and low-fat foods. We know the results. Obesity has exploded in America. And every time there's another push to get the lard out, America's big food businesses introduce more healthy snacks that are low-fat. Some substitute protein for carbs, but even that's not much help since the body converts extra protein into sugar. We just get fatter and fatter. Type 2 diabetes, which was unknown in 1900, is the greatest threat to America's health today, and it's getting worse. Some estimates put type 2 diabetes at 50% of the population by 2030. That's an epidemic, and our sugar, and wheat to be fair, subsidies are making it worse. Type 2 diabetes is the single largest cause of medical expenses in the U.S. So what can we do? Let's review a bit of physiology that we've covered before. When you eat carbs, your blood sugar goes up. In response, your pancreas secretes insulin, which forces that sugar into your cells to be stored as fat. When you've stored enough fat, you become resistant to insulin. That's called type 2 diabetes. Notice carefully. Type 2 diabetes is a dietary disease. It's not a genetic disease. That means that the proper treatment is also dietary. But what do government guidelines say? Avoid fat, eat more carbs. You've been poisoning yourself, so you should take more poison. And if that doesn't work, then we'll give you medicines to make you even more responsive to insulin, so you can store more fat and become even more insulin resistant. And if those don't work, we'll give you more insulin. Can you see how insane this is? Every medical treatment for type 2 diabetes makes the disease worse. The proper way to cure type 2 diabetes is to restrict carbs. This will lower blood insulin levels and allow you to start burning all that fat. This is proven medically in multiple studies. But won't that screw up your cholesterol? No. You make most of your cholesterol. You don't eat it. And a high-fat diet will actually lower your cholesterol, lower your triglycerides, raise your HDL, that's the good cholesterol, and lower your LDL, that's the bad cholesterol. Guess what? You'll lose weight, get off your diabetes drugs, and throw away those statins with their side effects. And we've identified another group that's subsidized by sugar subsidies: the medical and drug industries. Who pays for all these subsidies? You do. Every penny for every bit of sugar you eat, fat clothes you have to buy, and medical care you receive ultimately comes out of your pocket. $3 billion is about $10 per person per year and sounds like nothing. But the annual cost of medical care and lost income due to type 2 diabetes is over $250 billion, with a B, dollars. That's almost $800 for every man, woman, and child in America. America cannot afford to subsidize any industry, but sugar is part of a subsidy package that destroys millions of lives and over $250 billion in wealth every year. It's time to shut this subsidy down. Remember to like VidZ on Facebook, support VidZ on Patreon, and follow @VidZ on Twitter. Until next time, I'm Dr. Ted Noel, coming to you from Gdansk, Poland.